Have you ever loved someone for so long that you believed there wasn't a single secret left between you? Imagine spending 42 years building a life with the person you trusted more than anyone, only to wake up one ordinary morning and discover they had vanished without a goodbye. I thought losing my wife would become the greatest heartbreak of my life. I was wrong. The real heartbreak came later, when I climbed into our attic and uncovered a truth that had been hidden above my head for decades. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you are listening in the comments. My name is Daniel Carter. I'm 70 years old, a retired history teacher from Cedar Ridge, Pennsylvania. For most of my life, people described me as dependable. I spent 38 years teaching teenagers about the past, always reminding them that history had a way of revealing the truth, no matter how deeply it was buried. I just never imagined my own life would prove that lesson. My wife, Margaret, and I had been married for 42 years. We weren't wealthy and we certainly weren't perfect, but we had built something that most people spent their entire lives searching for. We raised one daughter, survived layoffs, illnesses, miscarriages, financial struggles, and the heartbreak of saying goodbye to our parents. Through every storm, Margaret remained my anchor. At least, that's what I believed. Every morning followed the same comforting routine. She would wake before sunrise, brew a fresh pot of coffee, water the flowers on our front porch, and wave at Mr. Henderson across the street as he walked his golden retriever. By the time I came downstairs, she'd already be reading the newspaper with her reading glasses resting low on her nose. That Tuesday began differently. The silence woke me before my alarm did. There was no smell of coffee drifting upstairs. No soft humming coming from the kitchen. No sound of the back door opening as Margaret stepped outside to feed the birds. At first, I wasn't concerned. I assumed she'd gone for one of her early walks around the neighborhood. She'd been trying to convince me to join her, joking that if I didn't start moving more, she'd have to replace my recliner because I'd wear it out. I smiled at the thought as I headed downstairs. But the smile disappeared almost instantly. The coffee maker was spotless. Her favorite navy blue mug sat upside down on the drying rack. The newspaper was still wrapped in plastic on the front porch. Margaret had never skipped her morning coffee, not once in 42 years. A strange knot formed in my stomach. Then I noticed the envelope. It rested perfectly in the center of our oak kitchen table, as though someone had measured the exact middle before placing it there. My name was written across the front. Daniel. I recognized the handwriting immediately. Margaret's. For a brief moment, I actually smiled. She loved leaving little notes around the house. Sometimes she'd tuck one inside my lunchbox when I was still teaching. Other times she'd hide one in my jacket pocket that simply said, "Don't forget you're loved." I expected another one of those. Instead, I unfolded a single sheet of paper that contained only 2 handwritten sentences. "I'm sorry. Please don't look for me." That was it. No explanation. No signature. No hint of where she had gone. My first instinct wasn't panic. It was disbelief. I called her cell phone. It rang once from upstairs. Confused, I hurried to our bedroom. Her phone sat neatly on her nightstand. Beside it was her wedding ring. I froze. Margaret had worn that ring every single day since I slipped it onto her finger in the summer of 1984. She wore it through surgeries, vacations, pregnancies, and even while gardening, despite my constant reminders that she'd lose it in the dirt one day. She would never leave without it. My hands trembled as I opened her closet. Half of her clothes were gone. Her small brown suitcase was missing. But everything else looked perfectly normal. No signs of an argument. No broken furniture. No forced entry. It was as if my wife had simply erased herself from our life overnight. Standing there in that silent bedroom, I kept asking myself the same question. Why? I had no idea that before this week was over, I'd discover Margaret hadn't made this decision overnight. She had been preparing for it for years. And somewhere inside our old house, the first clue was still waiting for me. I thought calling our daughter would bring me comfort. Instead, One simple answer she gave me made me question whether my wife had been hiding a secret from me for much longer than I ever imagined. I must have read Margaret's note a dozen times, hoping the words would somehow change. Maybe I'd misunderstood them. Maybe there was another page hidden inside the envelope. Maybe this was some terrible misunderstanding. But the note never changed. "I'm sorry. Please don't look for me." I stood there in our bedroom, her wedding ring resting in the palm of my hand, feeling heavier than any piece of gold should. It wasn't just a ring anymore. It was 42 years of promises sitting in my trembling fingers. My first thought was to call our daughter. Emily answered on the second ring. "Dad, everything okay?" Her cheerful voice made it even harder to speak. "No," I whispered, "your mother, she's gone." Silence. Not the kind that comes from bad phone service. The kind that comes when someone doesn't know what they're supposed to say. "Dad, what do you mean she's gone?" I explained everything. The empty house, the note, the missing suitcase, the wedding ring. Emily sighed. A deep, exhausted sigh. "I'll be there in 30 minutes. She hung up before I could ask another question. That wasn't like her. Emily had inherited Margaret's habit of talking through every problem. She was the kind of person who asked 100 questions before making a decision. But this time, she didn't ask where I found the note. She didn't ask whether I'd called the police. She didn't even ask if I was okay. 35 minutes later, her silver SUV pulled into the driveway. She rushed inside and hugged me tighter than she had in years. "I'm so sorry, Dad." She looked around the kitchen, then at the note lying on the table. For just a second, I noticed something strange. She didn't seem surprised. "Heartbroken." "Yes." "Worried." "Absolutely." "But surprised." "No." I tried to ignore the feeling. People react differently to bad news, I reminded myself. Maybe I was reading too much into it. "I already called your mom's phone," I said. Emily nodded. "She left it behind." I frowned. "I didn't tell you that." The color drained from her face. "You didn't." "No." For a brief moment, neither of us spoke. Then she forced a weak smile. "I just figured she wouldn't leave if she still had her phone." It sounded reasonable. Almost. But something about the way she avoided my eyes unsettled me. An hour later, 2 local police officers arrived. They listened carefully, took notes, and searched the house. Finally, one of them folded his notebook and looked at me with sympathy. "Mr. Carter, based on what you've told us, there's no sign of foul play. Your wife appears to have left voluntarily." Voluntarily. The word hit me like a punch to the chest. As the officers prepared to leave, one of them paused near the front door. "One more question." I looked up. "Has your wife been spending more time in the attic recently?" Every muscle in my body tightened. "The attic?" I asked. The officer nodded. A neighbor mentioned seeing her carrying boxes upstairs several times over the past few months. I turned toward Emily. She was staring at the floor. She already knew. I could see it written all over her face. And for the first time since Margaret disappeared, I realized my daughter wasn't just grieving. She was hiding something. I confront Emily about the attic, but before she can answer, an elderly neighbor walks across the street carrying something Margaret left behind, something with my name on it. The moment the police car disappeared down the street, I turned to Emily. "What did they mean?" I asked quietly. "Why would your mother be taking boxes into the attic?" Emily folded her arms, avoiding my eyes. "I don't know, Dad. Maybe she was just cleaning." I shook my head. "Your mother hated climbing those attic stairs. She used to make me go up there because she said the dust made her sneeze." Emily forced a small laugh, but it sounded hollow. "People change." "No," I replied, "not that much." She looked like she wanted to say something, but instead she grabbed her purse. "I should probably head home. If Mom calls me, I'll let you know." "If she calls you," I repeated. Emily froze for half a second before nodding. "I mean, if she calls either of us." She kissed my cheek and walked out the front door. I stood there watching her drive away, unable to shake the feeling that my own daughter knew more than she was willing to admit. For the rest of the afternoon, I wandered through the house like a stranger. Every room reminded me of Margaret. The Afghan blanket she always draped over the living room couch. The reading glasses she kept beside her favorite chair. The recipe book lying open in the kitchen, a dried lavender stem marking a page she'd never finish. The silence was unbearable. Around 4 o'clock, someone knocked on the front door. Standing on the porch was our neighbor, Harold Benson. Harold had lived across the street for nearly 30 years. At 78, he still insisted on mowing his own lawn and refused to admit he needed hearing aids. He removed his baseball cap as soon as I opened the door. "Daniel," he said gently, "I heard about Margaret." I nodded, unable to find the words. "I'm sorry, son." Harold reached into the pocket of his flannel jacket. "I almost forgot. She asked me to give you this, but only if she was gone." He placed a small brass key into my hand. It was old, worn smooth with age, and tied to a faded blue ribbon. "What is this?" I asked. He shrugged. "I never asked." "When did she give it to you?" "About 3 weeks ago." 3 weeks. My stomach tightened. "So she planned this?" Harold looked uncomfortable. "I don't know what she planned, but I do know she seemed peaceful." "Did she tell you where she was going?" He slowly shook his head. "No, but she did ask me one strange question." "What question?" He looked toward my house before answering. "She asked if I remembered when you renovated the attic back in the early 90s. I frowned. "The attic?" Harold nodded. Then she smiled and said, "Some things are easier to hide when everyone believes they've already been found." A chill ran down my spine. Before I could ask another question, Harold pointed toward the second-floor window. "You should probably go up there, Daniel." I looked at the tiny brass key resting in my palm. There was only one place in the house I had never completely emptied. The attic. And for the first time in decades, I couldn't remember exactly everything that was still up there. I had no idea what the key opened, but as I climbed the narrow attic stairs with my heart pounding in my chest, I couldn't shake the feeling that Margaret wasn't trying to make me find her. She was trying to make me find something else instead. I stood at the bottom of the attic stairs for nearly a full minute, staring into the darkness above me. In 42 years of marriage, that attic had never meant much to me. It was where old Christmas decorations collected dust, where boxes of forgotten clothes sat untouched, and where memories were packed away because life had simply moved on. At least, that's what I had always believed. The wooden steps creaked beneath my weight as I climbed, each one groaning louder than the last. A single pull chain hung from the ceiling. I reached up and tugged it. The old light flickered twice before filling the attic with a soft yellow glow. Nothing looked unusual. There were stacks of cardboard boxes, an old rocking horse Emily had loved as a child, my father's rusted fishing tackle, and shelves covered with years of forgotten belongings. I almost laughed. Maybe Harold had been mistaken. Maybe Margaret had left the key for something else. Then I noticed it. Against the far wall stood a large cedar chest. I had completely forgotten about it. It was covered with a white sheet, as if someone had intentionally hidden it from plain sight. I walked over and pulled the sheet away. The chest was beautiful, hand-carved with tiny oak leaves along its edges. Dust covered most of the lid, except for one small area where someone had recently brushed it clean. Margaret. She had been here. Recently. My pulse quickened. I knelt beside the chest and examined the lock. It was old brass, exactly the same color as the key Harold had given me. For a moment, I couldn't bring myself to move. A strange feeling settled over me. Opening that chest felt like crossing a line I could never uncross. Whatever was inside had been hidden from me for years. Once I knew the truth, there would be no pretending I hadn't. I slipped the key into the lock. It turned smoothly, almost as if it had been waiting. The lid opened with a long, tired creak. Inside were dozens of neatly organized items. Bundles of letters tied together with faded ribbon. Old family photographs. Several leather-bound journals. A small wooden jewelry box. And resting on top of everything else, a cream-colored envelope. Across the front, in Margaret's unmistakable handwriting, were 6 words that made my heart stop. For Daniel, when you're finally ready. My hands trembled as I picked it up. The envelope wasn't sealed. It was almost as if she had wanted me to read it immediately. I slowly unfolded the letter inside. The first sentence stole the air from my lungs. If you're reading this, it means I finally found the courage to leave. Not because I stopped loving you, but because loving you required me to keep a promise that has haunted me for 43 years. 43 years. We had only been married for 42. I read the sentence again. Then a third time. The numbers didn't make sense. Whatever Margaret was talking about. It had started before I ever became her husband. I lowered the letter into my lap, but before I could read another line, something slipped from between the pages and landed on the attic floor. It was an old photograph, and the man standing beside Margaret wasn't me. For a moment, I couldn't bring myself to pick up the photograph. It lay face up on the attic floor, just a few inches from my shoes, as if it had been waiting all these years for that exact moment to reveal itself. I bent down slowly and lifted it with trembling hands. The edges were yellowed with age, and a faint crease ran through the middle. It had clearly been folded and unfolded countless times. Margaret couldn't have been older than 23. Her long brown hair was blowing gently in the wind, and she wore the same warm smile that had first captured my heart all those years ago. Standing beside her was a man I'd never seen before. He looked to be around the same age, tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair and kind eyes. They weren't embracing, but they were standing close enough that it was obvious they knew each other well. I turned the photograph over. Written on the back in Margaret's handwriting were 4 words. The day everything changed. My heart pounded. Who was he? An old boyfriend. A relative I'd never met. Someone from college. After 42 years of marriage, how could there be a person this important whom she'd never once mentioned? I forced myself to continue reading the letter. Daniel, before your mind races to the worst possible conclusion, I need you to promise me something. Please don't let one photograph erase 42 years of love. The man you're looking at was never my lover, but without him, you and I would never have met. I exhaled slowly, realizing I'd been holding my breath. That should have comforted me. Instead, it only deepened the mystery. Who was he? And why had she kept his photograph hidden for more than 4 decades? I searched through the cedar chest, hoping for answers. There were dozens of neatly bundled letters, each tied with different colored ribbons. Blue, green, white. One bundle had a small handwritten tag attached to it. 1979. Another read. Before Daniel. My stomach tightened. Everything before Daniel. Those 3 words made it painfully clear. Margaret had preserved an entire chapter of her life that I'd never known existed. Just as I reached for the oldest bundle of letters, my cell phone rang loudly in the silent attic. The sudden sound made me jump. It was Emily. I answered immediately. Dad. Her voice sounded anxious. Where are you? I'm in the attic. There was a long pause. Then she spoke so quietly I almost didn't hear her. You opened the chest, didn't you? Every muscle in my body went still. How do you know about the chest? She didn't answer. Instead, I heard her breathing quicken. Dad, listen to me carefully. I'm listening. You can't read everything by yourself. The words hit me like ice water. You knew about this. Another silence. When she finally spoke again, her voice cracked. Mom asked me to stop you. Before I could ask another question, the call disconnected. I stared at my phone in disbelief. Margaret hadn't just hidden secrets from me. She had trusted our daughter to protect them. And suddenly, I realized I wasn't searching for one missing person anymore. I was uncovering a carefully planned truth that everyone seemed to know. Except me. I looked back at the bundle labeled 1979. My fingers closed around the faded ribbon, knowing that once I untied it, there would be no turning back. And whatever Margaret had hidden before I came into her life was finally about to speak for itself. For several minutes, I simply stared at the bundle marked 1979. The faded blue ribbon looked ordinary enough, yet it felt as though it was holding together an entire lifetime of unanswered questions. Part of me wanted to leave the attic, lock the chest, and pretend none of this existed. But another part, the history teacher who had spent decades telling students that the truth always mattered, knew I couldn't walk away. I carefully untied the ribbon. Inside were nearly 20 handwritten letters, all arranged by date. The oldest one rested on top. March 18, 1979. The handwriting wasn't Margaret's. It belonged to a man. "Dear Maggie," it began. "If you're reading this, it means I convinced you to take the letters home, just like I asked. Promise me you won't throw them away, even if life carries you somewhere neither of us expects." I frowned. Nobody except her parents had ever called Margaret Maggie. I continued reading. The doctors still won't tell me how much time I have, but I can read the fear in their faces. I know the truth, even if they refuse to say it out loud. My chest tightened. The man was dying. "There's only one thing I need from you now. Live your life, fall in love, build the family we've always talked about, don't waste your years mourning me." I stopped reading and looked back at the photograph. The smiling young man suddenly seemed different. Not mysterious, not threatening, just heartbreakingly human. I reached for the next letter. This one was written 6 months later. The handwriting was weaker, uneven. "Maggie, if fate is kind, one day you'll meet a good man. When you do, don't tell him about me unless you absolutely have to. He deserves to love you without living in another man's shadow." My throat went dry. He had asked Margaret to keep his memory a secret. Not because he was ashamed, because he wanted her future husband to have a chance at happiness. I leaned back against the attic wall, trying to absorb what I'd just read. Had Margaret really spent 42 years honoring the dying wish of someone she'd once loved? The thought stung more than I wanted to admit. Not because I doubted her love for me, but because I suddenly realized she'd carried a burden I had never even noticed. Just then, another folded piece of paper slipped from between the letters. Unlike the others, it wasn't addressed to Margaret. Across the front were 3 words. "To my husband." My hands began to shake. It was Margaret's handwriting. I unfolded it slowly. The very first sentence made my heart race. "Daniel, if you've reached this letter, then you've only discovered half the truth. The hardest part isn't who this man was, it's what he asked me to do after he was gone." I felt the air leave my lungs. Whatever promise Margaret had been keeping, it was far bigger than preserving a box of old letters. I reached for the next envelope, but before I could open it, I heard a loud thud from downstairs. Someone had just entered the house, and I was certain I had locked the front door before climbing into the attic. The noise downstairs wasn't loud, but in the silence of the attic, it sounded like a gunshot. Thud. Then another. I quickly folded Margaret's letter and slipped it into my shirt pocket. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. For a brief moment, I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe the old house had settled. Maybe a window had blown open. Then I heard it again. Footsteps. Slow. Careful. Someone was definitely inside. I looked around the attic for something, anything, I could use to defend myself. The only thing within reach was an old wooden walking stick my father used during the last years of his life. I grabbed it and started down the narrow staircase. Every step creaked beneath my weight. The closer I got to the first floor, the clearer the sounds became. A cabinet door opened, then closed. Whoever was there wasn't rushing. They acted as though they belonged in my home. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, I tightened my grip on the walking stick. The kitchen came into view. A woman stood by the sink with her back to me. For one impossible second, I thought it was Margaret. My breath caught in my throat, but as she turned around, I realized it was Emily. "Dad," she gasped, placing a hand over her chest, "you scared me." I could say the same thing. She looked at the walking stick in my hands. "Were you planning to hit me with that?" I didn't know who was in my house. She glanced toward the attic door. "So, you raid them?" It wasn't a question. I nodded slowly. "I read enough to know your mother kept a promise for more than 40 years. Emily lowered her eyes. "She never wanted you to find out this way." "Then what way did she want?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she walked to the kitchen table and sat down. "Dad, there's something you need to understand." "I'm listening." "When Mom asked me to help her, she made me swear I wouldn't tell you anything until you found the attic yourself." "So you knew about the chest?" "Yes." "You knew about the letters?" She nodded. "And you still watched me spend 2 days believing Mom had abandoned me." Tears filled her eyes. "It wasn't because she stopped loving you." "Then why did she leave?" "I can't answer that." My frustration boiled over. "You can't or you won't." Emily looked directly at me for the first time. "I promised her." The words hit me harder than I expected. Not because she refused to answer, but because I suddenly realized Margaret had planned every step of this. The key, the letters, even Emily's silence. Nothing about this was accidental. As Emily stood to leave, she reached into her purse. "I wasn't supposed to give you this until tomorrow." She placed a small sealed envelope on the table. Across the front, in Margaret's handwriting, were 5 simple words. "Open after the 7th letter." I frowned. "The 7th letter." Emily nodded. "You've only read 6. Then she walked out the front door before I could stop her. I looked down at the sealed envelope. If Margaret knew exactly how many letters I would read before finding this one, then she'd planned this journey in astonishing detail. And suddenly, I couldn't help wondering, how many more steps had she already arranged without me even realizing it? As the front door clicked shut behind Emily, I returned to the attic with the unopened envelope in my hand. But when I reached the cedar chest, I noticed something that hadn't been there before. A single letter was lying on top of the others, as though someone had just placed it there while I was downstairs. I climbed back into the attic with the sealed envelope still tucked inside my jacket. The house was silent again. Too silent. For a moment, I stood perfectly still, listening for another sound. Nothing. Just the faint hum of the air conditioner downstairs and the soft tapping of rain beginning to fall against the roof. Then my eyes landed on the cedar chest. I froze. I was certain the bundle of letters had been neatly stacked when I left. Now one envelope rested by itself on top of everything else. I slowly walked toward it. The paper looked old, just like the others, but I could have sworn it hadn't been there 20 minutes earlier. I glanced around the attic. No open windows. No signs that anyone else had come upstairs. Trying to calm my nerves, I picked up the envelope. Across the front were 3 handwritten words. "Read me next." It was Margaret's handwriting. I swallowed hard. Either grief was beginning to play tricks on my memory, or she had planned every detail so carefully that it only felt like the letters were appearing one by one. I carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a single page. "Daniel," it began. "By now, you're probably wondering whether I've been manipulating you. The answer is yes, but only because I knew you'd stop reading if I gave you everything at once. You always hated mysteries. Remember when you used to read the last page of a novel before finishing the first chapter? I couldn't let you do that this time." Despite everything, I let out a quiet laugh. She was right. I had always done that. Margaret used to tease me that I was the only history teacher who hated suspense. The smile disappeared as I continued reading. The man in the photograph was named Thomas Walker. So he finally had a name. Thomas wasn't just my closest friend. He was the person who taught me what courage looked like. He knew he was dying long before anyone else admitted it. Yet he spent his final months worrying about everyone except himself. I sat down beside the chest. Thomas, the stranger finally felt real. Before he died, Thomas made me promise 3 things. The first was that I would live a full life. The second was that I would never let guilt steal my future. I turned the page over. There was one final paragraph. The third promise is the reason I had to leave you. It's the promise I've carried for 43 years and the one I can no longer keep alone. My heartbeat quickened. Leave me. Because of a promise. That made no sense. Unless the promise wasn't about the past anymore. It was about something happening now. I reached for the next bundle of letters when something slipped from inside the envelope. It wasn't another letter. It was a folded road map. A small red circle had been drawn around a tiny town in western Pennsylvania. I unfolded it completely. Written beside the circle, in Margaret's handwriting, were 6 words that sent a chill through my entire body. This is where it all began. I had never heard Margaret mention that town. Not once. Yet somehow, I knew my answers weren't going to stay inside the attic much longer. Whatever happened 43 years ago, it had started there. I stared at the map for several minutes before grabbing my car keys, but just as I reached the front door, my phone buzzed with an unknown number. The voicemail that followed contained only 7 words, and I instantly recognized the voice on the recording. I stared at the unknown number on my phone for several seconds before answering. No one spoke. All I could hear was the faint crackle of static. "Hello," I said. Still nothing. Just as I was about to hang up, the call ended. A second later, my phone vibrated again. New voicemail. I frowned. Whoever had called hadn't said a single word while I was on the line. With a knot in my stomach, I pressed play. For a moment, there was only silence. Then a familiar voice spoke. "Daniel, if you're hearing this, it means you've opened the attic." It was Margaret. I gripped the kitchen counter to steady myself. Her voice sounded calm, almost gentle, but I could hear the sadness behind every word. "I know you're confused. I know you're angry. If I had stayed, you never would have let me do what I have to do." I closed my eyes. For the first time since she disappeared, it felt as though she was standing right beside me. "I'm asking you for one more favor," she continued. "Please don't hate Emily. She kept my secret because I asked her to. Every difficult choice she made out of love." A lump formed in my throat. Emily hadn't betrayed me. She had been protecting her mother. Margaret's voice grew softer. "The town marked on the map isn't where you'll find me." I opened my eyes. "What?" "It's where you'll find the beginning of the truth." The recording paused for a second before she spoke again. "When you get there, ask for Alina Brooks." The message ended with a quiet click. I immediately replayed it, hoping I'd heard her wrong. But the name was the same every time. Alina Brooks. I had never heard it before. Who was she? A friend? A relative? Someone connected to Thomas? I looked back at the attic staircase. The letters could wait. If Margaret wanted me to go to that town first, there had to be a reason. Within an hour, I had packed a small overnight bag, locked the house, and started driving west. The rain grew heavier as the miles slipped by. The interstate eventually gave way to winding 2-lane roads lined with old farms and forgotten churches. It was nearly sunset when I finally reached the town circled on Margaret's map. The welcome sign read, "Welcome to Ashcroft, population 2,184. The place felt frozen in time. Main Street was lined with brick buildings that looked as though they hadn't changed since the 1950s. An elderly man sweeping the sidewalk outside a hardware store noticed me studying the map. "You look lost," he called out. "I'm looking for someone." "Who?" I hesitated. "Alina Brooks." The man's expression changed instantly. He stopped sweeping. You mean Miss Alina? I nodded. He looked at me for a long moment before quietly saying, "If you're here because of Margaret Carter." My heart nearly stopped. "Then you're about 43 years late." The old man slowly set his broom against the wall and motioned for me to follow him. As I stepped onto the sidewalk, I realized this wasn't the first time someone had come looking for Margaret in Ashcroft, and whatever happened here had been remembered for decades. I followed the old man down Main Street without saying another word. The evening air was cool, and the rain had slowed to a light drizzle. Every few steps, he glanced back to make sure I was still behind him, as though he already knew how much this journey meant. Finally, we stopped in front of a small white house with blue shutters. It sat at the end of a quiet street, surrounded by rose bushes that had clearly been cared for with love. The old man turned to me. "Miss Alina has lived here for over 50 years, he said. "If anyone can answer your questions, it's her." He tipped his cap and walked away before I could thank him. I stood on the porch, my heart racing, then knocked. A few moments later, the door opened. An elderly woman, perhaps in her late 80s, looked at me through gentle gray eyes. "Can I help you?" she asked. "My name is Daniel Carter." The moment she heard my last name, her expression changed. She studied my face for several seconds before whispering, "So, she finally told you." I swallowed. "You know Margaret." A sad smile appeared on her face. "I knew her before she became Margaret Carter." She stepped aside. "You'd better come in." Her living room was warm and smelled faintly of cinnamon and old books. Family photographs covered nearly every wall, but one picture immediately caught my attention. It showed a much younger Alina standing beside Margaret. And beside them was Thomas, the same man from the photograph in the attic. I couldn't take my eyes off it. Alina noticed. That picture was taken just 2 months before Thomas died. So he really was sick. She nodded. "Very sick." I sat down across from her. "I've read some of his letters." Her eyes softened. "Then you've already learned he loved Margaret very much." I hesitated before asking the question that had been haunting me. "Were they engaged?" Alina looked directly into my eyes. "No." The answer surprised me. "They loved each other," she continued, "but they were never engaged. Thomas refused to let her tie her future to a man who knew he wasn't going to have one." I remembered his letters. "Live your life. Fall in love. Build a family." The words suddenly carried even more weight. Then why did Margaret hide all of this from me? Alina leaned back in her chair and let out a long sigh. "Because Thomas made her promise." "I know about the promise." She slowly shook her head. "No, Daniel. You only know about the first promise." A chill ran through me. There was more than one. There were 3. I frowned. "I already read that." "You read what Thomas wanted her to believe." My heart skipped a beat. "What does that mean?" Alina stood and walked toward an old wooden cabinet. From the top drawer, she removed a small leather journal wrapped in a faded cloth. She carried it back carefully and placed it in my hands. "This," she said quietly, "was never meant for Margaret." I looked down at the worn cover. There was no title. Only 2 initials pressed into the leather. T.W. Thomas Walker. Alina folded her hands in her lap. "He asked me to keep it safe until the day you came looking for answers." I stared at her in disbelief. "But Thomas died years before Margaret and I even met." "I know." "Then how could he possibly know about me?" Alina's eyes filled with tears. "Because, Daniel, Thomas wrote that journal for the man he believed Margaret would one day marry." I carefully opened the leather journal, expecting to find memories from Thomas's final months. Instead, the very first page contained a message addressed to me by name, and I couldn't understand how that was even possible. For several seconds, I simply stared at the worn leather journal resting in my hands. It didn't make any sense. Thomas Walker had died before Margaret and I had ever crossed paths. There was no possible way he could have known my name. Slowly, I opened the cover. The first page was yellowed with age, and the ink had faded slightly, but the handwriting was neat and unmistakably the same as the letters I'd found in the attic. At the top of the page, someone had written, "To the man who will someday become Margaret's husband." I let out a slow breath. Not Daniel. Not my name. Just the man she would eventually marry. I looked up at Alina. "You said it was written to me." She smiled gently. "It was written for you. The name wasn't there originally." I frowned. "Then who added it?" "Margaret did." That explained part of the mystery, but not all of it. I looked back at the journal and continued reading. "If you're holding this, then life has been kinder to Margaret than it ever was to me. For that alone, I owe you my gratitude." The words caught me off guard. Gratitude. You'll probably have questions about who I was and why my memory remained hidden for so many years. The answer is simple. I refused to become a ghost that haunted your marriage. I swallowed hard. Everything I had learned about Thomas pointed to the same conclusion. He hadn't wanted to take anything away from me. Quite the opposite. "Please don't waste your energy comparing yourself to me. Margaret deserves a husband who lives in the present, not one competing with a man from the past." I closed the journal for a moment. An unexpected feeling settled over me. Until now, I had imagined Thomas as a rival. But every word I'd read painted a different picture. He wasn't trying to hold on to Margaret. He was trying to let her go. Alina poured 2 cups of tea before speaking again. He loved her enough to disappear from her future. I nodded slowly. I think I'm beginning to understand that. But there are things Thomas never knew. I looked at her. "What things?" She hesitated. "He never learned what happened after his funeral." The room grew quiet. "What happened?" Alina's eyes drifted toward the rain-covered window. "Margaret discovered something that changed her life forever." My heart began to race again. "What did she discover?" Instead of answering, Alina reached beneath the coffee table and pulled out a small wooden box. It was no larger than a shoebox and secured with a tiny brass latch. "I've kept this hidden for 43 years. She placed it carefully in front of me. "Margaret asked me to give it to you only after you'd read Thomas's journal." I lifted the lid. Inside was a baby-sized knitted blanket, a silver hospital bracelet, and a birth certificate folded neatly beneath them. The blanket looked as though it had been lovingly preserved. The bracelet was tarnished with age, but it was the birth certificate that made my hands tremble. Across the top, in bold letters, were the words, "Certificate of live birth." I hadn't unfolded it yet, but somehow, I already knew that whatever name was written inside would change everything. As I slowly opened the birth certificate, one question echoed through my mind. If this child had been hidden for more than 4 decades, why had Margaret waited until now to reveal the truth? My hands were shaking so badly that I nearly tore the old birth certificate as I unfolded it. The paper was fragile, its edges worn from age, but the words printed across it were still clear enough to read. I scanned the page once. Then again. The mother's name read, Margaret Ann Collins. Her maiden name. My eyes moved to the next line. The space marked father was blank. No name. No signature. Nothing. I looked up at Alina. Why isn't there a father's name? She lowered her eyes before answering. Because Margaret refused to put one there. I frowned. Why would she do that? Alina sighed deeply. To protect someone. I stared at the document again. The date of birth caught my attention. It was from the summer of 1979. Just a few months before Thomas died. 1,000 thoughts raced through my mind at once. Was the baby Thomas's? Alina didn't answer immediately. Instead, she folded her hands together and looked directly into my eyes. That's the question everyone assumed they knew the answer to. My heart pounded. What does that mean? It means assumptions ruined a lot of lives. I felt more confused than ever. If Thomas wasn't the father, I didn't say that. And you didn't say he was. A faint smile crossed her face. Because that isn't my story to tell. Frustration washed over me. Every answer seemed to create two more questions. I picked up the tiny hospital bracelet from the box. The name engraved on it had faded, but a few letters were still visible. Beth. Elizabeth. I whispered the name to myself. It sounded strangely familiar. Who was Elizabeth? Eleanor looked toward the fireplace. She was innocent. Where is she now? I honestly don't know. The words hit me harder than I expected. You don't know. Eleanor slowly shook her head. Margaret made the hardest decision of her life after Thomas passed away. I leaned forward. What decision? Tears gathered in Eleanor's eyes. She gave the baby to a family that couldn't have children. I couldn't speak. For several moments, the room was silent except for the rain tapping against the windows. A closed adoption, Eleanor continued quietly. It was supposed to stay sealed forever. I looked back at the birth certificate. All those years, Margaret had carried the memory of a child she had never raised. A child she had never spoken about. Suddenly, another thought struck me. Did Emily know? Eleanor nodded. Yes, and I was the only one who didn't. I'm afraid so. I stood and walked toward the window, trying to process everything. Margaret hadn't hidden an affair. She hadn't been living a secret double life. She had been carrying unimaginable grief. But one question refused to leave my mind. If the adoption was closed, I turned back toward Eleanor. Why is Margaret looking for her now? Eleanor's expression changed. For the first time since I'd arrived, I saw genuine fear in her eyes. Because 6 months ago, she whispered, someone found Margaret first. Every hair on the back of my neck stood up. What do you mean? Eleanor slowly reached into her sweater pocket and removed a folded photograph. She handed it to me without saying a word. It was a recent picture. Margaret was sitting on a park bench. Beside her was a woman about 43 years old. The two of them were holding hands. Both of them were crying. I turned the photograph over, expecting a date or a location. Instead, there was a single sentence written on the back in Margaret's handwriting. The day our past came looking for us. I turned the photograph over in my hands again. The day our past came looking for us. Margaret's handwriting was unmistakable. I looked at the woman beside her. She appeared to be in her early 40s, with chestnut-colored hair and soft blue eyes. There was something strangely familiar about her smile, though I couldn't explain why. Eleanor, I asked quietly, is this Elizabeth? She nodded. Yes. I stared at the photograph, trying to understand how everything had changed so quickly. So she found Margaret? No, Eleanor replied. Margaret never stopped thinking about her, but she honored the adoption agreement. Elizabeth was the one who began searching after both of her adoptive parents passed away. I slowly sat back down. How did she find Margaret? A DNA ancestry test. I blinked. A what? One of those genealogy services. Elizabeth was curious about her biological family. She uploaded her DNA hoping to learn about her heritage. Eventually, someone connected the records and she hired a private investigator. The room fell silent. It sounded almost unbelievable. 43 years of silence, broken by a simple DNA test. When they finally met, Eleanor continued, Margaret was terrified. Terrified of what? Of losing the family she had built. The words struck me harder than I expected. She thought I'd leave her. Eleanor shook her head. No, she was afraid you would spend the rest of your life believing she had lied to you. I looked down at the photograph again. If only Margaret had told me herself. Would I have been shocked? Absolutely. Would I have been hurt? Without question. But leave her? Never. I wish she had trusted me. So did she. I looked up. What do you mean? Elena smiled sadly. She wanted to tell you dozens of times, on your 25th anniversary, again after you retired, then after your heart surgery 3 years ago. My head snapped up. She knew. Every time she gathered the courage, something happened that made her afraid she'd destroy the peace you had together. I remembered those years. The retirement adjustment. My surgery. Emily's divorce. Life had always found a way of pushing difficult conversations into tomorrow. Until there were no tomorrows left. Elena reached toward the coffee table and picked up another envelope. This arrived here 2 weeks before Margaret disappeared. She handed it to me. Unlike the other letters, this envelope had no handwriting. It had been typed. Across the front were the words, "Confidential." My stomach tightened. I carefully removed the folded papers inside. The first page was from a law office. The second was a copy of a will. I skimmed the document until one sentence stopped me cold. The estate of Richard and Helen Brooks is to be divided equally between their daughter, Elizabeth Brooks, and any surviving biological relatives identified before probate is completed. I looked at Elena in confusion. What does this have to do with Margaret? She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she pointed to the final page. There. I lowered my eyes. At the bottom of the document was a handwritten note. Mrs. Carter, we believe you may be the biological mother of Elizabeth Brooks. Please contact our office immediately. Suddenly, everything began to make sense. Elizabeth hadn't come looking for money. She had come looking for her mother. And Margaret hadn't disappeared because she was running away from me. She had disappeared because, for the first time in 43 years, she didn't know how to be a wife and a mother at the same time. As I folded the papers back into the envelope, my phone buzzed. It was Emily. The moment I answered, I knew something was wrong. Her voice was trembling as she whispered, "Dad, Mom just called me." My heart nearly stopped. "What did you just say?" I asked, gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. Emily took a shaky breath. "Mom called me." For a second, I couldn't speak. After nearly a week of searching, reading letters, chasing clues, and questioning everything I thought I knew about my marriage, Margaret had finally reached out. "Is she okay?" I asked. "Yes, at least I think she is." "Where is she?" "I don't know." My frustration returned instantly. "What do you mean you don't know? Didn't you ask her?" "I did, Dad. She wouldn't tell me." I closed my eyes and tried to stay calm. "What exactly did she say?" Emily's voice cracked. "She asked if you were safe." The question caught me off guard. "Safe?" Those were her exact words. She kept asking if you'd reached Ashcroft and whether you were alone. A cold feeling settled in my chest. Why would Margaret be worried about my safety? Before I could ask another question, Emily continued. "She also told me to remind you about something." "What?" "The journal." I looked down at Thomas's leather journal resting on Elena's coffee table. "She said you skipped several pages." "I didn't skip anything." "That's what I told her." Emily paused. Then Mom said, "Tell your father to stop reading like a teacher and start reading like a husband." The words hit me harder than they should have. That sounded exactly like Margaret. Whenever I became too focused on facts, she'd remind me that not everything in life could be understood through dates and evidence. Sometimes you had to understand people's hearts. "I have to go," Emily whispered. "Wait. What?" Did Mom sound happy? There was a long silence. Finally, Emily answered. "No." My chest tightened. She sounded relieved. The call ended. I slowly placed my phone in my pocket and looked at Elena. She had been listening quietly. "I think I know what Margaret meant," she said. She picked up Thomas's journal and gently flipped through its pages. "You're reading every word." "Of course." But you're only looking for answers. She opened the journal near the middle. Have you noticed these? I leaned closer. Several pages had tiny pencil marks in the margins. Some words were underlined. Others had little stars beside them. I thought those were random. They aren't. Who made them? Margaret. I carefully examined one of the underlined sentences. It read, "The greatest burden isn't keeping a secret. It's believing the people you love will stop loving you once they know it." Another sentence had been circled. "Fear has a way of stealing years that love would have gladly forgiven." I felt a lump rise in my throat. For the first time since this journey began, I stopped thinking about the mystery. I started thinking about Margaret. How many nights had she lain awake beside me, carrying this weight completely alone? How many times had she wanted to tell me, only to lose her courage? As I gently turned another page, something slid from the back cover of the journal. It wasn't another letter. It was a hotel key card. Taped to it was a small handwritten note from Margaret. "If you've learned to read with your heart, you'll know exactly where to find me." Beneath the note was the name of a hotel. Not in Ashcroft. Back in Cedar Ridge. Less than 15 minutes from our home. I stared at the card in disbelief. All this time, Margaret had never been hundreds of miles away. She had been waiting almost in my own backyard. I thanked Alina, climbed into my car, and started the long drive home. But as I pulled into the hotel parking lot just before midnight, I saw a police cruiser parked near the entrance, and my heart sank before I even stepped out of the car. By the time I reached Cedar Ridge, it was almost midnight. The roads were nearly empty, and the hotel parking lot was illuminated by a handful of yellow streetlights. My eyes immediately locked onto the police cruiser parked near the front entrance. Every terrible possibility raced through my mind. Was Margaret hurt? Had something happened to Elizabeth? Or had I arrived too late? I parked the car so quickly that I barely remembered turning off the engine. My legs felt weak as I hurried through the lobby doors. A young woman behind the front desk looked up. "Can I help you, sir?" "I'm looking for my wife." She gave me a polite smile. "I'm sorry, but I can't give out guest information." Before I could plead with her, one of the police officers stepped forward. "Mr. Daniel Carter." I nodded, my heart pounding. "Yes." He extended his hand. "I'm Officer Reynolds. What happened? Is my wife okay?" The officer glanced toward the elevators before answering. "Mrs. Carter called us herself about an hour ago." I stared at him in confusion. "She called the police?" "Yes." "Why?" "She said she wanted us here, just in case." "Just in case of what?" He hesitated. "She said tonight would be one of the hardest conversations of both your lives." I felt my throat tighten. The officer gave me a reassuring nod. "She asked us not to interfere unless either of you requested it." I slowly walked toward the elevator. Room 214. The numbers on the key card Margaret had left me suddenly felt heavier than they should have. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime. The hallway was quiet. Every step toward room 214 felt longer than the last. Finally, I stood in front of the door. My hand trembled as I slid the key card through the reader. The light turned green. I pushed the door open. Margaret was sitting beside the window, wrapped in a gray sweater, staring out at the city lights. She didn't turn around immediately. "I wondered how long it would take you," she said softly. Her voice was exactly as I remembered. Warm, gentle, comforting. For several seconds, neither of us moved. 42 years of marriage. 1 week of silence. A lifetime of unanswered questions. Finally, she stood. When she turned to face me, I could see tears already filling her eyes. "I'm sorry, Daniel." I crossed the room without saying a word. Then I wrapped my arms around her. She broke down instantly. The quiet sobs that escaped her shoulders told me more than any letter ever could. For the first time in days, She wasn't carrying the burden alone. We stayed like that for what felt like forever. Neither of us needed words. Eventually, she stepped back and gently held my face in her hands. You read the letters. I did. You met Alina. I nodded. And Elizabeth. I know about her. Margaret closed her eyes. I should have told you years ago. Yes. She looked down. I was afraid. I know. A tear rolled down her cheek. But that's not the secret that made me leave. I frowned. What do you mean? She walked over to a small table near the window and picked up a thick manila envelope. She held it carefully, almost reluctantly. I asked you to follow the clues because I needed you to understand my past before I told you about the present. She placed the envelope in my hands. I received these medical results 3 weeks ago. My heart skipped a beat. Medical results. I looked from the envelope back to Margaret. She managed a faint smile, but it couldn't hide the fear in her eyes. Daniel, I wasn't trying to protect myself. She reached for my hand. I was trying to protect you. With trembling fingers, I opened the envelope. The first page carried the logo of a cancer center, and before I could read another word, Margaret quietly whispered the sentence I had been least prepared to hear. For a moment, I couldn't bring myself to read the papers. The logo at the top of the first page was enough to make my stomach turn. A regional cancer center. My hands trembled as I looked at Margaret. She stood quietly across from me, her eyes filled with fear, not fear for herself, but for me. Please, she whispered, rate it. I lowered my eyes to the report. The medical terms blurred together until one sentence came into focus. Diagnosis, stage Roman III ovarian cancer. The room began to spin. I read the line again, hoping I had misunderstood it. But the words remained the same. I looked up. No. Margaret nodded slowly, tears slipping down her cheeks. I found out 3 weeks before I left. 3 weeks. The same amount of time Harold had said she gave him the brass key. Everything had been planned from the moment she received the diagnosis. You've been sick, I whispered. For a while. And you never told me. I wanted to. Then why didn't you? She walked closer and gently took my hands. Because I remembered what happened after your heart attack. I frowned. What does that have to do with this? You nearly died, Daniel. Her voice broke. The doctors told me stress could trigger another cardiac event. When I received my diagnosis, I couldn't bear the thought of putting you through another nightmare. So you decided disappearing would hurt less. The question escaped before I could stop it. Margaret looked down. I know how foolish that sounds now. It doesn't sound foolish. It sounds impossible. She nodded. I thought if you hated me for leaving, it would be easier for you when. She couldn't finish the sentence. When what? When I wasn't here anymore. The silence that followed felt unbearable. I stepped closer until we were only inches apart. Margaret. She shook her head. I've watched people lose the love of their life to cancer. I couldn't bear the thought of watching you slowly lose me. I felt tears burning my own eyes. You didn't give me a choice. I know. You decided for both of us. I know. You let me believe I'd done something wrong. I know. Every answer was the same. Not because she didn't care. Because she had already punished herself more than I ever could. I sat beside her on the edge of the bed. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then she reached into her purse and pulled out another folded document. This isn't part of my medical file. I unfolded it carefully. It was an appointment confirmation. Chemotherapy. The date was tomorrow morning. You've already started treatment. She nodded. I delayed it until I knew you'd understand why I left. I looked at her in disbelief. You waited for me. I couldn't begin fighting for my life while believing I'd destroyed yours. I took both of her hands in mine. Listen to me carefully. She met my eyes. I didn't drive across 2 counties, dig through 43 years of secrets, and chase your trail just to lose you now. A small smile finally appeared through her tears. It was the first genuine smile I'd seen on her face since I walked into the room. But before either of us could say another word, someone knocked softly on the hotel door. Margaret looked toward it. "I think," she whispered, "it's Elizabeth." As I walked toward the door, my heart was racing again. I had spent days searching for my wife, only to discover another family waiting on the other side of that door, a family I never knew I had the chance to become part of. I stood frozen in front of the hotel door. For the first time in days, I wasn't searching for answers. I was standing face to face with them. The secrets, the pain, the family story that had been hidden for more than 4 decades. Margaret squeezed my hand gently. "Daniel, before you open that door, I need you to know something." I looked back at her. "What?" "Elizabeth didn't come here because she wanted to take my place in your life." Her voice trembled. "She came because she wanted to know where she came from." I nodded slowly. "I understand." But the truth was, I didn't know what I was about to feel. Would I be angry? Would I be confused? Would I be able to accept a daughter who had existed for 43 years without me knowing her name? I opened the door. Standing in the hallway was the woman from the photograph. "Elizabeth." She looked nervous, almost afraid. For a few seconds, none of us spoke. Then her eyes moved to Margaret. "Mom." That one word carried a lifetime of emotions. Margaret immediately stepped forward, and the two women embraced. They didn't say anything. They didn't need to. The tears on their faces told the entire story. I watched quietly as a mother held the daughter she had never been allowed to raise. A daughter who had spent years wondering where she came from. After a few moments, Elizabeth turned toward me. "Mr. Carter." I smiled sadly. "Daniel." She nodded. "Daniel." There was uncertainty in her voice. "I know this is strange." "Yes," I admitted, "it is." She looked down. "I don't want to make things harder for either of you." I walked closer. "Elizabeth, you've already spent your whole life believing a part of you was missing. I'm not going to be another person who makes you feel unwanted." Her eyes filled with tears. "Thank you." We spent the next few hours talking. Not about money. Not about the adoption. Not about the years we lost. We talked about simple things. Her childhood. Her adoptive parents. Her favorite memories. The small details that make up a person's life. And as she spoke, I noticed something. She had Margaret's laugh. The same way she tilted her head when she was thinking. The same habit of touching her necklace when she was nervous. It was impossible not to see the connection. Around midnight, Elizabeth finally looked at Margaret. "I need to ask you something." Margaret nodded. "Anything. Why did you leave Daniel instead of telling him?" The question was gentle, but it was the question I had been asking myself since the beginning. Margaret looked at me, then at Elizabeth. "Because I was afraid." "Afraid of what?" "That if Daniel knew everything at once, my past, my illness, and the daughter I gave away." Her voice broke. "He would look at me differently." The room became silent. I reached for Margaret's hand. "I do look at you differently." She looked terrified. "But not because I love you less." I squeezed her hand. "I look at you differently because I finally understand how much you carried alone." For the first time since this nightmare began, Margaret smiled without sadness. But just as we thought the hardest part was behind us, Elizabeth pulled a small envelope from her bag. I almost forgot. She handed it to Margaret. "It came yesterday." Margaret looked at the sender and immediately went pale. I noticed the change in her expression. "What is it?" She slowly turned the envelope over. Then whispered, "I was hoping this day would never come." Margaret opened the envelope with shaking hands, and what she pulled out wasn't a letter. It was a legal document that revealed one final secret. A secret connected to Thomas, Elizabeth, and a promise Margaret had kept for more than 40 years. Margaret stared at the document in her hands as if she had seen a ghost. For several seconds, nobody in the hotel room moved. The excitement of finding Elizabeth, the relief of finally understanding the truth, and the hope of rebuilding our family all disappeared beneath the weight of whatever was written on those pages. "Margaret," I said softly, "what is it?" She didn't answer. Instead, she handed the document to me. I looked down. It was from a law firm in Ashcroft. At the top was a name I recognized immediately. Thomas Walker. My eyes moved through the document slowly. It was a trust agreement. Thomas had created it shortly before his death. The purpose: to provide financial support for a child who might one day search for her biological family. Elizabeth. I looked at Margaret. Thomas knew. She nodded. He knew I was pregnant before he passed away. Elizabeth covered her mouth. How? Margaret took a deep breath. Because he was the first person I told. The room became quiet. I was scared, Margaret continued. I was 23 years old. I had just learned I was going to become a mother, and Thomas had been given a diagnosis that meant he might not have much time left. She looked at Elizabeth. I wanted to keep you, I wanted to raise you, but I was alone and I was terrified. Elizabeth wiped away tears. And Thomas, he told me something I never forgot. Margaret smiled sadly. He said, Maggie, love isn't always measured by what we keep. Sometimes it's measured by what we're willing to sacrifice so someone else can have a better life. I finally understood. Thomas hadn't been a chapter Margaret was hiding from me. He was a person who had shaped the woman I fell in love with. A person who had helped her make impossible decisions. The legal document explained that the trust had been waiting until Elizabeth was found. Thomas had wanted her to know she was never forgotten. She had always been loved. Elizabeth held the document against her chest. I spent my whole life wondering if my birth parents thought about me. Margaret reached for her hand. Every single day. Those words broke something inside me. For years, Margaret had carried the pain of losing a child. For years, Elizabeth had carried the pain of not knowing where she came from. And for years, I had unknowingly been standing beside a woman who was much stronger than I ever realized. The next few months changed our lives completely. Margaret began treatment. Some days were difficult. Some days were frightening. But unlike before, she was no longer fighting alone. Elizabeth visited often. She and Margaret slowly built the relationship they had lost decades ago. It wasn't easy. 43 years couldn't be erased overnight. But love has a strange way of finding its path, even after being delayed for a lifetime. As for me, I learned the greatest lesson of my life. Sometimes the people we love don't hide things because they don't trust us. Sometimes they hide things because they are afraid their pain will become our pain. But love isn't about protecting someone from every hardship. Love is about standing beside them when hardship finally arrives. A year after Margaret's diagnosis, we returned to the attic together. The same attic where I had discovered the secrets that nearly broke me. Margaret looked around and smiled. I always knew you'd find the truth eventually. I laughed. You planned all of this. She smiled. I knew you better than anyone. I held her hand. And for the first time in a long time, there were no secrets between us. Only memories. Only love. And a family that had found its way back to each other. The end. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching.